Wonderful to see you all here, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Campbell, who's our speaker today. Dr. Campbell is in the United States, fortunately visiting at Stanford, and so we can take advantage of you not being off in Hong Kong for the year. So normally Dr. Campbell is the chair professor in the Division of the Social Sciences at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and he also holds the position of a distinguished professor at the Central China Normal University. His work is widely recognized for sort of being at the forefront of work on stratification and inequality, particularly as it's intersecting with historical Chinese data. And Dr. Campbell is really at the forefront of sort of thinking through both multi-generational stratification processes and also thinking of the true like long-term consequences, demographic consequences of stratification processes. So we'd ask that you sort of hold most of your questions for the end. If you can ask sort of clarifying questions as we go, and I'm thrilled to hand it over to Dr. Campbell.
Okay, well, it's really an honor to be back here. I was trying to figure it out. I think my third time visiting the CDE. I came once, I think, when I was a postdoc at Michigan in the mid-90s, and then I think again sometime in the 2000s. And then this is my third time. I don't know if I get a special jacket or kind of special privileges or something like that. Saturday Night Live was a Five Timers Club or something like that. But anyway, it's a really pleasure to be here because so many, all through my career, there's been all these sort of connections to Wisconsin between colleagues at UCLA who had spent time at Wisconsin, either Rob and Judy, and then or other colleagues who had studied here or did postdocs here, like Megan Sweeney and so forth. And then I think one thing I'm really proud of is, of course, that people from my time at UCLA who were students at UCLA when I was there are now in leadership roles here I guess they're not here today, but people like Christine and Jenna and so forth. So it's really a pleasure to be back here. So what I wanted to talk about today, it's a little bit different from a kind of you might say, typical talk, which is sort of here's my question, here's my data, here's my or regression, and then and so forth. What I'm trying to do in this talk is, I think, sort of in the last year or so, I guess, while I've been at Stanford, we've been looking back at my older line of work on Chinese population, Chinese family, and trying to kind of think about how to relate all the things that we did over the years to contemporary population phenomena in China. I think, there's obviously a huge literature and a lot of discussion about population and family in China, but it's in some ways ahistorical. Meanwhile, of course, there's a large literature on family and population in historical China, but right now, these two areas are sort of not connected together well. So these are some thinking I've been doing about trying to kind of connect what's going on now in China in a more systematic way to all the empirical findings that have accumulated, not just from us, but from others as well, about China in the past, before the 20th century. So, hey, okay.
Just click on the slide.
Okay,
and then
I got it. Okay. So right now, I guess if you're working on Chinese population, it's a good time to be a sort of demographer working on China, because China's population is back in the news. It was, of course, there was a lot of discussion of China's population in the 80s and 90s because of the one-child policy and all the other things that were going on. And then maybe in the 90s and 2000s, people's attention drifted elsewhere. But in the last few years, I think there's been a revival of kind of general interest in contemporary trends in Chinese population, with people focusing on things like the persistent, very low fertility in China, TFR somewhere between 1 and 2, probably closer to 1. Maybe some people even think below 1. So persistent low fertility that has persisted even after the complete abolition of the notorious one-child policy. And then, at the same time, when it comes to the family in China, marriage is changing rather dramatically. So the mean age at marriage, say even back in the 1990s, was around 22 for females. It's already risen to 24. And if you look at the major cities like Shanghai and Beijing, it's much higher than that now. So there, people are marrying much later. Some reason to think maybe more and more people are not marrying at all, but it may be a couple decades, before we really know if people are permanently celibate. And I won't be getting into it too much in this talk, but the divorce rate is rising in China. We don't have any divorce in historical China. At least we don't have any records of it. So I don't have much to say in terms of history, but rising divorce rates. And, all of these things are combining together to, I think, sort of create a trend that is really what is driving attention to Chinese population right now, which is that, as it was reported a couple months ago, the estimates are that China's population has peaked and it's probably now declining. And the peak, if you believe these projections, maybe it was a couple months ago, maybe it was last year, maybe it'll be later this year, but one way or the other, the population has peaked, and it is going to be declining for the foreseeable future, at least for the next few decades, which is a big change. If any of you remember back, well, none of you, probably very few of you remember what it was like in the 1980s and even earlier, the 1970s, when people were panicking about the prospects of a sort of an overpopulated China and so forth. But now we're looking at population decline. And related to that, a increase in the share of the population that is aged in China, which presents all sorts of challenges when it comes to things like pensions, labor force, healthcare, and so forth. So there's a lot going on when it comes to population and family in contemporary China that I think is attracting a lot of attention. And there are, fortunately, beyond the sort of trends that I just talked about, there are a lot of data sets for studying contemporary China. The Charles, the age, it's based on the HRS, the aging study, the China Family Panel study, and so forth. So, if you I just checked Google Scholar a few weeks ago, and the sort of the numbers of papers that are being published on aspects of China's population or family that are making use of these data sets is expanding quite rapidly. So like 1,700 papers in 2022 alone that refer to the Charles and so forth. So we're in a sort of a new era for studying family and population in China using longitudinal data, which is great. And if you look at a lot of the topics that people are working on, marriage timing and prevalence, socioeconomic status differences, assortative mating in terms of education and so forth, divorce, reproduction and childbearing. I mean, this is a big one right now, but people trying to understand what is happening in response to the abolition of the one-child policy. I think the shorter answer is not much. The birth rates are still low, not much evidence of effects of policy change, and then intergenerational relationships. So what I want to turn to now is sort of having hopefully convinced you that there's a lot to talk about when it comes to contemporary China and population and contemporary China, family in contemporary China. What I want to go back and talk about it is family and population in China in the past. And, for quite a long time, I think we really struggled in the sense of collecting empirical data, qualitative or quantitative data on kind of family and population in China in the past. So, starting in the, before these surveys became available, in the 1980s, we had the censuses. They were the 1982 census was probably easier to access than the 2020 census. The 1990 census, the fertility surveys of the 80s. There were various geographically focused, one-shot surveys like Baoding survey by Marty White, ethnographies, interviews by White and Parrish, and so forth. But this was actually for a long time in the 70s and 80s. We really, we had these sources, which allowed for the estimation of some basic parameters related to family life. But we didn't really know much about the period before the 70s, and a lot of the, I think, most important developments in family life in terms of change in family life actually came out of ethnographies like Yen Yunxiang's studies of kind of the family life and so forth. So if you want to go even further back, beyond, say, the 1970s and the 1980s, it used to be sort of even scarcer, that there were surveys and so forth in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. The Buck survey, surveys by Sidney Campbell, and others that illustrated or provided some basic information on family and population in the early part of the 20th century. And then, but sort of beyond that, before the 20th century, it was just blank in terms of what we knew about family and population in China. And most of what we thought we knew was sort of, you might say, stereotypes at some level, that in the absence of any empirical data, people just bought into the idea that, Malthus was right, that, before the 20th century, China was just grotesquely overpopulated, that people kind of reproduced irresponsibly and had too many, children. This was, this is sort of a dominant, there were all the tropes essentially about, what family and population were like in China before the 20th century, because of the absence of empirical data. And then, but this began to change in the 70s, because at the same time that, there were sort of new contemporary studies, surveys, and so forth being done in China, there were a variety of people who began collecting historical data and trying to build data sets and analyzing it systematically. So you had people taking family genealogies, turning them into data sets, people like Liu Cuirong, Steve Harrell, Ted Telford, Zhao Zhongwei, and people working with household registers like Arthur Wolf, James Lee, and myself, and so forth. And so finally in the 70s and 80s, we began to get some picture of an empirical picture of what family and population were like in China before the 20th century, based on more systematic surveys or sources like marriage. So we began to get an insight into marriage, reproduction, mortality, living arrangements, and kinship. And also we began to do more systematic comparative studies where people had had similar materials for other places like Japan, Europe, and so forth. We began to make more systematic comparisons that allowed us to move beyond kind of cliches that we had inherited from essentially Malthus going down. So I would argue that, so right now, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the sort of the historical and the contemporary studies of China's family and population have been kind of moving, they've been sort of separate. They haven't really been connected. And so I see this when I get papers sent to review, on contemporary China, and to the extent there's any sort of historical context, quite often people are still, citing, things from the 1950s about, the quote traditional Chinese family, some of which is true, some of which has, I think, been debunked and so forth. So I think what, just as we sort of rely on empirical descriptions, quantitative or qualitative, to understand family and population in contemporary China, I think we need to integrate all of the things that we've learned about historical China when we talk about family and population in China. So as I mentioned, if you look at a lot of contemporary papers on China, if they mention in passing, quote, sort of the traditional Chinese family, there'll be references to, say, son preference, or maybe a family size preference, or, living arrangements, sons living with their elderly parents and so forth. And again, little engagement with accumulated empirical findings, especially related to behaviors that are no longer common. And in fact, this would sidetrack me, but there's a tendency that, well, we know now that before the 20th century, family life, family forms, family-related behaviors in China were a lot more diverse than we appreciate, than we tend to think now. So, for example, adoption was much more common than we realize. There were different forms of marriage and so forth, and these all disappeared. But when you see contemporary discussions of the family and population in China in the past, the tendency is to sweep all the complexity that existed actually under the rug and just talk about the fact that, when women married, they moved in their husband's household and so forth. But I think a proper engagement with all the things that we've learned about the past in China for family and population would actually enrich contemporary studies. My inspiration here, or our inspiration, because this is with other people as well, is that in the 1970s, I don't know if this is taught anywhere, but in the Cambridge group, they had these sort of classic studies of English family and population history, which completely transformed the understanding of family and population in the English past. That before the 1970s in the UK, it was actually widely assumed that, and not just for the UK, but before all this empirical work was done with historical data, there was kind of a general assumption that before the sort of 18th century in England and elsewhere in Europe, that kind of, you might say, traditional families and so forth looked like families you might see in the Middle East or Africa or Asia, with many people living together under one roof and so forth. There was sort of a projection where they assumed that these kind of traditional agricultural societies, what people observed there represented a sort of a natural stage in development. And therefore, 400 years ago in England, maybe marriage must have been arranged, people must have lived together in kind of joint households and so forth. And then Peter Laslett, Richard Wall, a variety of other people in the 70s began, collecting historical data, and in fact showing that things like the nuclear household was actually common in England, probably going back to, I think, the 14th or 15th century, which was it turned over a lot of people's views. So there's this earlier, you might say, example where historical studies based on empirical data completely upended everyone's notions about what the family and population were like in the past. And I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that even if we may not, through our work, completely upend everybody's beliefs about family and population in the Chinese past, there's still a lot to be learned that will inform our contemporary understandings, just as the work that Laslett and the Cambridge group did for England. So just to talk a little bit about some of the work over the last few decades, some of which I've been involved in, some of it by others, which has been using empirical data to get a better understanding of family and population in China in the past. There was early work by Arthur Wolf, who's passed away a few years ago. He was an anthropologist at Stanford. He had remarkably, starting in the 1970s, he had constructed databases from population registers maintained by the Japanese colonial authorities in Taiwan in the first half of the 20th century, and did some landmark studies of marriage and adoption in Taiwan, but in the first half of the 20th century, showing that adoption was extremely common, that there were all sorts of variant forms of marriage where, contrary to our contemporary notion, that there were lots of cases where men were actually moving into the wife's household as a ruzhui upon marriage, and then living with their wife's family and so forth. So he really, you might say, complicated the picture when it came to thinking about family forms in traditional China. James Lee, myself, Wang Feng, we've had a line of work using genealogies and population registers, mainly for Northeast China, but also for some other populations. And then there have also been a series of edited volumes, published articles, people using lineage genealogies like Steve Harrell, and Ted Telford, and Zhao Zhongwei. And I'll mention some examples of, I think, some key findings. The other thing that's happened in the last 20 years is comparative studies that I mentioned previously, where we, for example, in our case with the our Chinese household register data, we worked with people working with Japanese household registers, Belgian, Swedish, and Italian household registers to do comparisons of marriage, fertility, and mortality in the past across these different settings, and in particular, kind of compare the relationships between kind of demographic behavior, economic stress, and family organization. So we have 3 volumes. We started in 1994, and we're actually working on a 4th volume now, so on migration. So it's been a sort of a long project. There's been a kind of a similar project, sort of a Dutch-Taiwan comparison as well, that has produced 4 volumes comparing kind of family in the Netherlands and Taiwan. That's been going on for quite a while. So there's a lot of work is accumulated. I'll mention some of the back to some of the sources. A lot of this work that I've been involved in was made use of the China, what we call the China multi-generational panel databases. These were data sets. I'll give you some samples in just a second, constructed from household registers. So from household registers from Liaoning in the 18th and 19th centuries, Shuangcheng and Heilongjiang also in the late 19th century. And then we haven't made it public yet, but we've had for some time in fact, a data set constructed from the genealogy of the Qing imperial lineage. It's about, I think, 70,000 males or so forth over about 14 generations. In Taiwan, there's still an active research project where people have been constructing databases from household registers compiled by the Japanese colonial authorities between, I think, pretty much 1905 and 1945. And then various data sets with family genealogies going over several centuries. And there's related sources for Korea and Japan, so a lot of opportunities for comparative work as well. So I'll mention, I'm going to talk in detail at the presentation tomorrow on our data, so I'm only going to mention, just to give you a taste, what some of the population registers look like that have helped us learn so much about family and population in China's past. But we have these population registers that record the population at regular intervals, at least in Northeast China and in the 18th and 19th century. either triennial or annual. And you can think about it like a series of censuses where it's very easy to link people from one census to the next because they're listed in the same order in every edition. And so they provide household and community context, demographic events, social and economic status, and entrances and exits into the population. So the data sets look a lot, if any of you have worked from, I think, the health and demographic surveillance sites from the in-depth network, it's sort of like that kind of data in the sense that it's a well-defined geographic area within which a populations and households are followed continuously over time. And these are the two data sets that I'll go into more detail tomorrow if you're coming to that presentation, so I won't get into too much detail. Just a kind of a sample, this is, I guess we have about, this is from DAO-E, so there are about 130,000 frames like this that we transcribed into a data set, so 1.3 million records where every column is one person. And then where you see like here, I know only a few of you read Chinese, but where you see these elevated columns, that indicates the beginning of a new household. So this is a new household here, here, and then here. And then is these elevated columns are basically for the household head. And then you have other members of the household. This is the wife of the head, his first son. This is a new household. This is one person living alone, and so forth. So basically, we transcribed about 100,000 frames. Where we didn't. I mean, we had a team of people doing the transcription, and then it becomes very easy to link people across. This is 3 years later, roughly the same families, and it becomes very easy to link them. So that's just a sort of a sample of the data. Another population for which we have data, Shuangcheng, a little more interesting, and these data are all actually public now, so you can learn more if you come tomorrow, or you can just go to the websites and download the data. Shuangcheng is a little bit more interesting in some ways because this is a frontier population in what's now Heilongjiang province in northeast China. And it was quite a, if you're interested in sort of unusual natural experiments, it was quite interesting because this originally was a frontier area through the mid-19th century. And the Qing government there were a lot of people, they're called bannermen, living in Beijing because they had a sort of hereditary affiliation with the conquest army that had conquered China in 1644 and established the Qing. And so a lot of these people were sort of living on stipends in Beijing and nearby, and not really doing much in the 17th and 18th centuries. And the Qing government was getting tired of sort of subsidizing their lifestyles in the tea houses and so forth. So it decided to ship them up to Heilongjiang, and where they could do something useful, which was open up some what was at the time kind of frontier land. So they took this population of essentially urban bannermen and convinced them to relocate to Heilongjiang, which would be, it'd be the equivalent of taking a bunch of people living off of trust funds in New York City and convincing them to move to North Dakota and become farmers or something like that. But anyway, they moved up to Heilongjiang, and then at the same time, the government knew that these people probably didn't know much about farming, so it actually relocated a lot of people from farmers from neighboring provinces in to the same area, and then it began recording them in great detail on an annual basis. The reason being that they were farming government land, so they wanted to keep track of who was on the land. But the interesting thing about Shuangcheng was that there's actually we have land holding data for which has been our Chen Shuang at Iowa has worked a lot with that that's an example of the land holding. So you can link, say, demographic behavior to land wealth and so forth. So we're, after all this work constructing data sets and doing these different studies, what have we learned? We have some earlier synthetic publications, and so I won't go into too much detail on some of the earlier stuff, but some things that essentially we all thought were true about family and population in the past in China indeed turned out to be confirmed by empirical data. So nearly all women married. I think every population for which we've been able to locate data suggests that before the 1950s, nearly all women married, and they did so by their mid-20s. We've never come across a population where we had data that wasn't true. But also with only a few exceptions in most populations, many men remained unmarried. Now, there's always been kind of an assumption that this is probably the case. People have talked about these sort of bare branches and these sort of, this is a kind of recurring trope of the idea of these unmarried males being kind of upset and then rebelling and so forth. But at any given time, it seems like there were somewhere between 5 and 15% of men were never marrying. And that's, again, true in most populations for which you can find data. Female, I think, infanticide was actually common and systematic. So this was this was earlier work, so it's not that new, but infanticide, which I think people had generally thought was only used in times of crisis, was actually much more systematic. We found strong evidence for it in the imperial lineage, where I think you could argue that none of these people were in dire financial or economic straits. And so infanticide was practiced. Adult sons lived with their parents. Again, if you read a Chinese novel, this is kind of pretty much what you would expect for any novel set before the 20th century. And households were hierarchical. And again, I think you would expect this from qualitative, things like novels and so forth. But then we also, had a string of contradictions, which you might say, I think, at least challenged prevailing notions about the kind of population in the Chinese past. The biggest one, which was quite controversial, and we had a big debate about it in PDR and other places, was we, like others, found that marital fertility in China was much, much lower than in Europe. So that even though all women married, once they were married, their birth rates were much lower than in Europe. So that by the time women reached age 45, their average number of births, the TFR, was about the same as in Europe. So you had kind of two different pathways to about roughly the same TFR. I think for this audience, I don't need to explain TFR, but and then we also, I think, showed that there was evidence of deliberate control, that people were deliberate about their behavior. This was hugely controversial because Malthus's influence had been so powerful that Malthus had he basically had concluded, without ever coming to China or really in the absence of any real data, he had concluded that he assumed, he knew that women in China all married. This was back in 1800, and then he assumed that once they were married, they had babies at the same pace as women in Europe. He didn't actually have any data for it, but he sort of assumed it. So I'll get to you in just a second, Boyan. But this was the origin of this kind of notion that China was just horribly overpopulated. It was basically this Malthusian assumption that people were just having babies, they were marrying earlier, but having babies just like European women, leading to incredibly high TFRs. And I think we and others showed that we just can't find any data where this is the case. The marital fertility rates are all quite low. And so that really, I think, overturned big, you might say, sort of big idea in Chinese population history. Boyan, you had a question, or? Yeah. So it varies. I mean, this could almost be another talk, but some data sets are actually, I think, pretty complete. Like the most complete is the imperial lineage data set, where they actually would record births even if the baby died on the same day. Then they would write in for the death date Ben means or Ben Yue if they died in the first month, because they had all sorts of administrative reasons to track anyone with some association with the lineage very carefully, because they were worried about pretenders to the throne and something. So somebody goes off and comes back 20 years later and says, "Oh, I'm whatever." So they were other data sets. Recording is less complete, and then you have to sort of adjust and so forth. But it's something we could talk about tomorrow. The other thing, which always quite often sort of upset a certain part of the audience when I used to give talks on marriage, was that every piece of data we found suggests that polygyny was extremely rare. If you watch too many movies or you read too many novels, which tend to focus on kind of elite families, you would have this idea that all these, men had multiple wives, and then it turns out that even in the imperial lineage, which was obviously an elite population, by the 19th century, most men only had one wife. And then in our rural data sets, we probably have, out of several 100,000 men, there's maybe 20 or 30 that appear to actually have more than one wife or concubine at the same time. There was remarriage, so there was, you might say, serial polygyny, where widowers might remarry, but polygyny was extremely rare outside of kind of elite families. And this is kind of a big disappointment to a certain kind of demographic in some of the talks I've given about marriage. But anyway, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in the household registers, they would actually annotate the Liaoning registers. They would put in things like 切 or 次世 so there's no reason to think they were being omitted. And I think it's really just that in a rural population that was pretty close to the margin, right? They think it was just, people might remarry if they were widowed, but I think for much of the population of China, before the 20th century was poor, and having a concubine or a second wife was actually quite expensive. So, the sorts of families that get written about in novels, like in the Hong Lo Meng or Jinping Mei or something like that, of course, those are, not typical families, but people, I think, became fixated with some of these ideas, but it just turns out it's quite rare. Quite often you can run into people whose, great-grandparents, great-grandfathers might have had concubines in the 20s or 30s, but, quite often if you, learn, these tend to be people families that were quite wealthy by the standards of the time. So I have a few results on polygyny in just a second. And then the other big thing was mortality levels didn't really differ systematically from Europe. That this notion that China was just this miserable, poverty-stricken, compared to Europe, sort of not really a dystopia, but high mortality regime just didn't seem to be true. That there was, both in Europe and China, there was enormous local variation, almost from one town to another, or from one county to another. You might have huge differences related to the kind of ecological context, but continental differences were quite limited. So, and then some other complications where we discovered some phenomena that at some level, if you talk to people with very traditional notion of what family and population were like in the past, that weren't supposed to happen. So we found in our household registers, there's actually a fair amount of widow remarriage. So ostensibly, widow remarriage during the Qing dynasty was supposed to be rare or non-existent, because the Qing dynasty was more, you might say, quote, Confucian than previous dynasties, that widow remarriage was supposedly frowned upon. But if you can find it, it's very clear in the registers that many women, if they were widowed when they were in their 20s, and if they didn't have a son, they would, it was recorded directly in the register, they'd remarry out again. And this varied by socioeconomic status and so forth. I mentioned that polygyny, it existed, but it was rare. I'll show you a figure. It actually seems to have been, even when men were polygynous, it tended to be a sort of serial monogamy, where the evidence we have on where we have birth histories, for the different wives, it's sort of one wife in sequence, then another wife, and you don't have people fathering children with different wives at the same time. It tends to be, I'll get into that in just a little bit. And then adoption was extremely common. And I mentioned before, alternative marriage forms were also common. Rude's Way, little sister-in-law marriage, where and so forth. So I want to just kind of provide some kind of examples of specific findings where we've either confirmed or contradicted or sort of uncovered new things over the years. One is that SES, socioeconomic status differences in marriage in the past in China, pretty much followed the patterns you would, they predict, not predict, but they're very much in line with patterns that you see in contemporary China. So for women in historical China, essentially, this is one example, but high status women married later. So one of the phenomena you see in contemporary China is that sort of higher status women, where status is measured with educational attainment, tend to marry later, maybe more likely not to marry at all, but that's, I think, not clear yet, but certainly marrying later. But even in historically, that here we're looking at sort of status is measured in the institutional affiliation of different populations. But basically, without going into too many details, the this is so essentially the might say the highest status women married later. They would all marry in this historical population, but they would marry later. And then lower status women would marry faster. So here, the Shuangcheng Jingqi, this was sort of a high status population in Shuangcheng. And here the women, it's the bottom line here. And so actually even out at age 40, it's, this may be, problems with the data, but it seems like 5% of them are still unmarried, which I suspect is not correct, but certainly they're marrying later. And then the lowest status population in this comparison is essentially right here. Is that right? I'm sorry, yeah, okay, this is the Jingqi. And then maybe the best is Liaoning regular, or Liaoning specialized populations, or women are marrying in much higher proportions. And, I could do this. I have regression results where we have women's marriage timing according to the status of their father, and you get the same results, that women with high status fathers were marrying later, and so forth. And then when you get to men, it's the exact opposite. So the men who married earliest were essentially the highest status males. So the Shuangcheng Jingqi that were the latest marrying women were the earliest marrying men. So there's a sort of a mirror image of sort of high status delaying marriage for women, but accelerating it for men, which is actually a direct parallel to what we observe in contemporary China. So this is at least one case where we're seeing kind of a direct analog in terms of the patterns. When it comes to assortative mating, again, I'm picking results that are sort of the easiest to present, but they're sort of examples. But for mid-20th century China, where we have direct data from another data set of materials that were collected in the run-up to the Cultural Revolution, the Siqing Jiating Chengfen Dengji Biao, which were these forms, household forms that were compiled in 67 and 68 in the run-up to the Cultural Revolution. We can do work on assortative mating, and we find very strong evidence of both educational, even in a population where actually there was very little educational levels of women were very low. Like many women were illiterate, or just had a 1 or 2 years of education. Even in a population like that, there was still pretty strong evidence of assortative mating by education, piled on top of assortative mating based on kind of, family wealth before 1949, and class labels, which were based on wealth after 1949. And so this parallels, again, I think, contemporary phenomenon with assortative mating. Fertility, this just, I mentioned the sort of the relatively low marital fertility of Chinese populations. So this was at the time, we wrote this, but this was not just by ourselves, but others. Obviously Japan isn't China, but the patterns are actually quite similar. So we included that for comparison as a sort of larger Europe-Asia East Asia comparison. But the marital fertility rates pretty consistently across a wide variety of different settings and time periods were about half of what they were in Europe. So now, of course, all women married, so the net result was that the TFR was about the same as in Europe. But turning to fertility, in the one population where for at least some period polygyny was relatively common, that is the early decades of the imperial lineage, most of the finding, results that we had suggested that polygyny was actually not, there was polygynous males had somewhat higher age-specific fertility than monogamous males, but the big difference was that actually polygyny seemed to be used mainly to extend the reproductive lifespan for males, not to increase, you might say, their age-specific fertility. And which is, I think it contradicts a lot of, you might say, popular notions about what people were doing in polygynous marriages. That the most, and then we've done other work actually where we had the births associated with different mothers over time, and what was pretty apparent is that you would see a sequence of births from sort of wife number 1, then another sequence from wife number 2, and so forth, but you didn't see births being mixed between your number 1, number 2, 3, 2, 1, etc. And, the indication, there's some reason to think that polygyny was not sort of the way, it might have been depicted in, say, The Last Emperor or some movie like that, but rather what it looks like is that when men went on to a second wife or something, they were essentially ceasing at least conjugal relations with the previous wife. They were maintaining, relationship and so forth, but they were essentially, it was almost I wouldn't say, society where, essentially women were without husbands, were sort of isolated to some extent. It almost, the implication is that the earlier wives were, they were sort of, they had claims on the husband's family and so forth, and stayed. And it's open to speculation whether, this is almost like some sort of divorce, but where they, didn't leave the household, because that would have been impossible at that time. So we have a very different picture of polygyny and its implications. I think another big finding, which, you would sort of expect from mathematical modeling, but people, I think, don't really appreciate, which is that, again, if you think about one common, you might say, assumption about the kind of traditional Chinese family, again, if you've been reading, watching movies or reading novels, you have this notion of the household as this big bustling place where there's all these cousins and brothers, and all the elderly people have all their grandchildren around them, and but actually, that birth rates were moderate and death rates were so high that when you actually look at real data, large numbers of people, it turns out, had no surviving children when they were in old age. So, for example, here we're just looking at sort of horizontal axis is age, and then just the shares of men with the specified numbers of living sons. And, if you look at 60-year-olds, something like just under 40% of 60-year-old males had no surviving sons before the 20th century. So, I mean, this raises, I think, a big question for, people that want to talk about, well, gee, people had children in the past because children would take care of them in their old age. But actually, for 40% of the population, it didn't work, right? 40% of people, they got to be 60 and they didn't have any sons. So presumably there were other arrangements and so forth. But I think there's some real questions about, what was really going on. And, I haven't made this comparison yet, but it may very well be that the proportion of people with no surviving sons might have been actually higher in the past than it is now. But that's maybe for something, for you to work on. Similarly, for all of the talk about, okay, the need to take care of sort of elderly parents, in fact, because death rates were high, a lot of people didn't have surviving parents to take care of. So if we look at the easiest one to look at is the no parents alive. So by the time a man was age 40, so by the time men were age 40, half of them had no surviving parents that their wife would have to take care of. They didn't take care of the daughter-in-law typically took care of the husband's parents. So again, we probably have now much higher shares of people, in their 40s that have actually surviving parents than was the case in the past. And the other thing is it's harder to read, but basically, we can, using the House of Register data, we can look at kinship networks. We can count in real time how many surviving brothers men had, how many first cousins they had, and so forth. And so, I mean, here is here we have the proportion of men, according with their, with 0 surviving grandsons. And so something like around when you get out to age 70, something like 60% of men had no surviving grandsons. So they're essentially their line was going. This was a rural population, was going extinct, and this was looking at the number of men with living brothers. So if by age 40, something like 40% of men had no surviving living brothers. So again, in some ways, if you look at kinship networks in the past, because of the high mortality, probably look a lot more like ones now as that have been produced by the one-child policy, where people have actually relatively now, back in the past, people may have grown up with more siblings, but as they age, they end up, in terms of the number of siblings, looking a lot more like contemporary families. And then finally, this is from work with Songqi. The extension of descent lines was quite common. So this is basically just the share of males with no surviving, offspring isn't the right word, descendants. We're starting from 1760 and going forward, but say among men that were low status in 1760, something like more than 60% of them, this is in the imperial lineage, had no surviving descendants 100 years later. So again, for all of the talk about people wanting to have lots of children to ensure the survival of their descent lines and so forth, in fact, in spite of people's best efforts, that just they were not able to do that. High status males were somewhat less likely to be extinct, but it was still quite common. And this is one reason why adoption was actually so common, was that people made up for the inability to, you might say, reproduce biologically by with large amounts of adoption between related kin. So, just a summary of the, some of the, I'd say, key findings that are relevant to thinking about what's going on now. When we look at marriage, it was always, I think, sensitive to socioeconomic status and economic status. So we saw those differentials in the past, very similar to what is going on now. Now, people these days are deferring marriages for other reasons, but certainly lack of economic security is one of them. I think one of our arguments is that, one of the things that you've probably seen in the news is that even though the one-child policy was abolished a few years ago, there's been no increase to speak of in birth rates. Some people are surprised by that because, for decades, certainly in the 70s and 80s, we were all being told that families just, unless they had this kind of policy imposed on them, they would just have too many children, because it was kind of their historical imperative was, for people to have sons to maintain their descent line. But the government removed the one-child policy completely. Birth rates haven't budged. And this, I think, reflects that in our sort of historical data, I didn't present as much of the relevant findings here, but people essentially calibrated their fertility according to their economic circumstances even before the 20th century. They had moderate fertility before the 20th century, well below, you might say, what their biological capacity was, and we have other evidence of deliberate control. People before the 20th century, in fact, didn't max out on the number of sons. They may have tried to minimize their chances of not having any sons at all, but back then they didn't max out on the number of children. So we shouldn't be surprised when nowadays, when people feel all sorts of pressure and so forth, economic and otherwise, that they're also not rushing to take advantage of the elimination of the one-child policy. And I think one thing we have to think about when we think about the Chinese family is that the sort of era of large kinship networks where people had lots of siblings, lots of surviving cousins, etc. So I think those of you, from China, you probably would say, your parents, well, actually, maybe your grandparents probably have lots and lots of siblings, surviving siblings and cousins and so forth. But I think the evidence we have from this historical data is that this kind of era of very large kinship networks was probably a transitory phase from the early and mid 20th century, when death rates were already beginning to fall, probably certainly in the 1950s, but in some parts of China they were falling earlier. That you had sort of a decline in death rates that was not immediately offset by a reduction in birth rates. And so you had this brief period where sort of kin networks are very large. But if you go back to before the 20th century, kin networks in many ways sort of looked like maybe what they look like now, where of course now they're produced by low fertility, but back then they were produced by high mortality, where people, when they reach my age or something, they had probably didn't have surviving siblings, and they might not have any surviving cousins. So I think we can, based on these and other results, I think when we are thinking about contemporary studies of the family in China, there's a lot of work that's out there about the historical family that can be used for context for, I think, a better understanding of kind of how we got where we are in contemporary China. And I want to emphasize, and I'll talk about tomorrow, is that with the public release of historical data sets, contemporary researchers can do historical work as well if they would like to. In fact, there's some, as I'll talk about tomorrow, there's some features of the data sets that we made public that in terms of their ability to follow families over generations that you can't do with contemporary Chinese data. And so we also have the prospect of kind of direct historic comparison across different settings. So I think that's it. And then what is it? We go to 1:30. Okay, so we have some time for questions then.